Urfa Man, the oldest life-size statue of a human ever discovered, and it's dated to about 9000 BCE, was discovered not far from Gobekli Tepe and is considered to be made by the same people who made Gobekli Tepe. And there's a couple things I want you to notice about Urfa Man. And the first thing is the position of the hands and the arms. Now, I call this position navel hands because his hands are meeting just below the navel, almost cradling the navel, and you can see his fingers are clearly defined. And the next thing I want you to notice about Urfa Man is his eyes. They're inlaid with obsidian, and this is going to become important later. And the final thing I want you to notice about Urfa Man is the peg at the bottom of the statue. Now, you can't see it too well in the museum, but in this photograph that was taken slightly after Urfa Man was discovered, you can see it very well. There's a large peg at the bottom of the statue where Urfa Man would stick into the ground. Now this hand position, the hands meeting below the navel, this is not unique to the Urfa Man statue. We see this motif again and again throughout the Gobekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Tepe complex, Testepler region. And just let's take a stroll through the Urfa Museum real quick, and we will see numerous instances from the artifacts found at Gobekli Tepe. There's artifacts found at Karahan Tepe, where you can see similar hand positions, and even the site of Navel Genesis, which is now sadly submerged, but they have this replica temple of Navel Genesis at the Urfa Museum, and you can see similar hands, similar positions on the T-pillars of Navel Genesis, and again at Gobekli Tepe, the T-pillars themselves have their arms kind of meeting with their hands just below their navel. All right, now let's head to Sardinia, where archaeologists have discovered a very curious figurine that I think might look a little bit familiar to you. Here we find a similar arm position, hands meeting just below the navel, and also a peg, which you'll remember from the Urfa Man statue. And this peg is where the statue would stick into the ground. Now, this figurine was found at the site of Monte Ducati. And Monte Ducati is one of the oldest structures in the world. It dates to 4000 to 3650 BC. And we're here at Monte Ducati now. We're looking at it. Monte Ducati is, well, it looks like a ziggurat. It has hallmark styles of a Mesopotamian ziggurat, including this enormous central ramp. And this is seen in the ziggurat of and other ziggurats. And actually, in Iraq, the ziggurat of Uruk was being built at the exact same time as Monte Ducati. The dating of the ziggurat of Uruk is 4000 to 3800 BC, and the dating of Monte Ducati is 4000 to 3650 BC. So at the same time they're building a ziggurat in Iraq, they're also building what you would call a ziggurat in Sardinia. What this suggests, I think, quite strongly is that there was Mesopotamian influence at work here in Sardinia from its earliest phases. And again, I think we see that in the naval hand style figurines, and we see that in the ziggurat style construction, but it seems as though people from Mesopotamia had come here around the same time that the Mesopotamian civilization was beginning and got to work here as well. Quick note here before we move on: when you visit Monte Ducati, the visitor center gives you an app to download, and the app even says that the most similar structure to the altar of Monte Ducati is the Mesopotamian ziggurat, built in Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium BC, pictured with this photo. Now let's head to the Cagliari Museum in Sardinia, where we can see they've found many of these figurines all over Sardinia at many ancient sites. Back at Monte Ducati, there's a very curious stone or stones that were found next to the site, and this is a gigantic stone sphere with a smaller stone sphere, and there were probably 3 more of these smaller stone spheres originally. And what we're looking at here is a navel stone. This stone is marking the navel. And there's a lot of imagery of the navel amongst these statues and these figurines. The hands are always meeting right below the navel, and this is an actual navel stone. And just keep that in mind for a minute, because this is a motif that also pops up across the ancient world. Before we move on, I just want to jump back to the app that the Visitor Center gives you at Monte Ducati, because they make two mentions of this navel stone, or omphalos. And the first screen says, during the second part of the 5th millennium BC, around 4300 BC, this area was already occupied by a village with elliptical-shaped huts. At the end of the last phase of the Neolithic, from the year 3500 BC, another village was built. The people called Cultura de Ozieri, this is the Ozieri culture, the pre-Nuragic culture that built Monte Ducati and built these figurines, erected here quadrangular-shaped huts. In that period, the menhir was situated at the left of the ramp. That's that huge standing stone that you see, whereas the omphalos and the altar slab were located at the right. So unpacking this a bit, you've got this existing Neolithic village in 4300 BC, and then around 3500 BC, you've got the Ozieri culture, and they sort of show up, and it seems like they recruit the existing Neolithic village to erect a menhir and mark the site with an omphalos and start building a ziggurat. It's almost as if people from Mesopotamia came here with a Mesopotamian-style figurine and a Mesopotamian-style building and a Mesopotamian plan, a civilization plan, and got to work. There's another section on the omphalos, and it says, the big semi-spherical stone is not in its original place. It was found outside the east wall of the archaeological area. It might have been a sacred stone like an omphalos, Greek word meaning navel, the most famous one being the Delphi omphalos, i.e. navel of the world, a representation of the divinity's presence or a sun symbol. But they don't really know what the navel symbolism means. But I think I do. We have to head now to Easter Island, a very, very tiny island in the very middle of the Pacific Ocean, where we're going to find some really interesting things. So everyone knows the moai of Easter Island, the stone giants, some of them weighing over 80 tons, and the Easter Islanders built almost 900 of these giants and positioned them pretty much in a ring around the island, all looking inward, kind of like there's something they want us to see. And if you notice, all of the moai have their hands meeting just below their navel. Some of them it's weathered away and you can't see it, but originally every single moai had their hands meeting just below their navel. Just like the figurines from Sardinia and Monte Ducati, just like Urfaman, just like the T-pillars of Gobekli Tepe, and so on. And the interesting thing on Easter Island is their navels are marked. Now, a lot of the moai are weathered, so you can't see it on all of them, but every moai originally had a navel. You could see their belly button, and you could see their hands meeting just below their navel. And the original name for Easter Island was Tapito Te Hunua, which means navel of the earth. Easter Island also has a navel stone, of course, a large stone sphere surrounded by 4 smaller stone spheres. Quite similar to Monte Ducati in Sardinia. Finally, the back of one of the moai almost matches Pillar 43 of Gobekli Tepe. So let's go back to Gobekli Tepe and check out Pillar 43 again. So here we are looking at the actual Pillar 43 in situ at Gobekli Tepe, and we can see a similar zigzag type shape here taking the form of a scorpion. Above that, a band possibly representing the horizon, and above that we have a sphere flanked by 2 birds, and then above that an M shape with a few more birds, and then of course the famous handbags. But let's take a look at the museum and compare the moai and Pillar 43 side by side and get a better look. So really it looks like this pillar at Gobekli Tepe has sort of been translated into the back of the moai. 11,000 plus years had passed between Gobekli Tepe and Easter Island, but somehow whatever message is being conveyed on this pillar made it to Easter Island and was carved into the back of at least one moai, but I think it might have actually been carved on several moai. I'd like to offer a possible solution or decoding of this message. I'm going to get to that in a minute, but what I'd like you to notice right now is the orientation of the birds in relation to the sphere or disc that you see on both pillars. And in pillar 43 of Gobekli Tepe, the bird presenting the sphere is facing towards it, but the bird to the right of that bird is facing away from it. And on Easter Island, both birds are facing towards the sphere. And if you think I'm crazy for suggesting a connection between Easter Island and Gobekli Tepe, then tell me why all the Moai have their hands in the same exact position as Urfaman in the T-pillars. Looking at Google Earth now, we can see what I suspect to be an ancient land bridge connecting Easter Island to South America when the sea level was lower. And where does it lead but straight to Cusco? In the Quechuan language, the native people of the Andes, Cusco means navel of the world. Well, that was the same name that the Easter Islanders gave to their island. But wait, because the name Gobekli Tepe literally translates into navel hill or belly hill or potbelly hill, and it's been given that name because the hill itself appears to be a navel. Now, I haven't been able to find good information as to how long people have been calling Gobekli Tepe the Navel Hill, or if it's been called this for thousands of years. But if you know how long that name has been in existence, please let me know. Now look at this. If we follow what I suspect to be the ancient land bridge, well, it meets the continent of South America right at Nazca, famous for the Nazca Lines. Could the Nazca Lines be commemorating this ancient land bridge? And could there be any significance to the birds that we find drawn there? And here's a head they found at Gobekli Tepe. Notice the deep eye sockets, the nose, the lips. And here's a head that I photographed on Easter Island. Notice the deep eye sockets, the nose, the lips. Could we be looking at a proto-Moai here at Gobekli Tepe? Sounds crazy, I know, but if we pan to the left, we can see a statue with its hands in the same position as the Moai of Easter Island. Now, a little known fact about the Moai of Easter Island, all the eyes were originally inlaid. And this is one of the big mysteries of Easter Island because all the eyes are missing. But originally, all the eyes had these beautiful coral inlays, and they've only ever found one of the eyes. But because of the way the eye sockets are constructed, they know they all used to have them. And getting back to Urfaman, well, Urfaman has inlaid eyes as well. Now, Urfaman's eyes are inlaid with obsidian, whereas the Easter Island Moai eyes were inlaid with coral, but it's still interesting that they both had inlaid eyes. Now let's be clear, absolutely no connection is acknowledged between Easter Island and Gobekli Tepe, but what are the chances that Urfaman has inlaid eyes and the Moai have inlaid eyes and Urfaman's hands meet just below his navel and the Moai's hands meet just below their navel and Easter Island has a navel stone and is named Navel of the Earth and Gobekli Tepe is named Navel Hill and Pillar 43 of Gobekli Tepe seems to be encoding the same message on the backs of the Moai? That's a lot of connections for two civilizations that are separated by 11,000 years and supposed to have no connection whatsoever. So what is going on here? Why does Easter Island have a navel stone? Why are all the Moai pointing to their navel? Why is the name of Easter Island originally the Navel of the Earth? Why does a seemingly ancient land bridge lead to Cusco, and Cusco's name means Navel of the Earth? Why does Monte Ducati in Sardinia have a navel stone? Why do the figurines there point to their navel? Why is Urfaman pointing to his navel? Why is the name of Gobekli Tepe Navel Hill? Well, you know what? Thank God for the Greeks, because I think they actually are going to shed some light on this for us, because Delphi, Greece, is also a navel of the world. And the Greeks have handed down to us a myth about their navel. And like so many myths, I think there is a grain of truth to it. And the Greek myth is very simple, and it's so profound at the same time. And it is that Zeus sent two eagles around the world, and where they met, that was the navel of the earth. That was Delphi. This myth of Zeus sending the two eagles out around the world to mark the Omphalos, this myth, I think, is the key to the whole thing. And like so many myths, I think there is some truth to this myth. And I think what is actually being described in this myth is groups of civilizers, civilizer deities, civilizer groups of humans dressed in bird-like garb, bird-like civilizers. I don't know if they were setting out from Gobekli Tepe or if they were setting out from some earlier place or some other place, but I think that groups of bird-like civilizers were setting out around the world, heading east, heading west, and they weren't marking omphaloses where they met, they were marking omphaloses where they were birthing new civilizations. So wherever these civilizers would go, they would birth a civilization somewhere and mark it with an omphalos. And that's my theory that I'm calling the Navel Genesis Theory, and it's that navel stones and navels of the earth around the world actually mark the birthplaces of civilizations by an ancient order of civilizers that were traveling around the globe in opposite directions, often identifying as birdmen, starting civilizations, and marking them with navel stones, omphaloses, sometimes in name only, sometimes with actual navel stones, and also we often see this accompanied by navel hand figurines and statues. There was actually an ancient civilization in Serbia, Bulgaria, and northern Greece that predates the classical Mesopotamian civilizations, the Vincha culture, from 6000 BC. They have the earliest known form of writing, and they have a navel stone. And here's their navel stone. This is from about 6000 BC on display at the Sofia Museum in Bulgaria. And this looks nearly identical to the Greek navel stone, but the Vincha navel stone has a bird engraved on the top of the stone. I think that this bird is actually signifying one of the birds that was flying around the world to mark the omphalos and birth civilizations. Let's look at some Vincha artifacts online and see what we can find. And if we just do a quick Google search for Vincha artifacts, we already see a lot of figurines with curious hand positions similar to that of Urfaman. And look at this artifact right here. This artifact this figurine looks almost exactly like Urfaman. And if we click on it, we can see that this artifact is actually for sale. It's supposedly from the 5th millennium BC, and I guarantee you this artifact is authentic because here again we find an omphalos or navel stone, and we find the navel hands. What I'm calling the navel hands is this hand position around the navel. Getting back to the myth of Zeus sending his 2 eagles around the world to mark the omphalos, here we have the Mesopotamian Apkallu, and it is an eagle-headed, well, actually, it's a human wearing an eagle costume, and it's one of the civilizer deities of Mesopotamia. The name Akpallu means sage. These were considered to be one of the 7 sages, where they would appear in groups of 7, and they restarted civilization after the flood. And here we have an Olmec sculpture of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, the feathered deity, the civilizer deity of the Americas, who taught the people of the Americas agriculture and astronomy and how to build pyramids and start civilization. And of course, you'll notice that both Quetzalcoatl and the Akpallu not only are both associated with birds, but are both carrying the famous handbags from Pillar 43 at Gobekli Tepe. This ancient cult of civilizers was active in Sardinia, and that's why you find a navel stone there. They were active in Easter Island, and that's why you find a navel stone there, and why all the Moai have navel hands, and also why all those Sardinian figurines have navel hands. I think they were active in Delphi in Greece, and that's where you get the myth of Zeus sending his eagles out around the world, heading east, heading west. I think the Vincha culture, which predates the Mesopotamian civilization by thousands of years and predates the Greek civilization by even more thousands of years, but has a nearly identical omphalos or navel stone with a bird carved on top of it. I think the Vincha culture was a product of that birthing process as well. So just to be clear, what I'm saying is that I think the Apkallu were actual humans dressed as birds, starting civilization in Mesopotamia. And I think Quetzalcoatl was an actual human dressed as a bird or a bird snake, bringing civilization to the Americas. And I think that Thoth was an actual human dressed as a bird who started civilization in Egypt. And if you'll notice, all the depictions of the bird-like civilizers are very careful to always reveal that they are in fact human. And you'll start to see this again and again the more we look at it. So let's decode the back of the Moai and Pillar 43 through the lens of Navel Genesis Theory. We'll start with Pillar 43 at Gobekli Tepe. First, we have the handbags at the top. These handbags represent the package of civilization that these civilizers are bringing. We're talking about agriculture, astronomy, pyramid building, mythologies. These handbags represent the kit that they're bringing with them while they mark the omphalos and birth civilization. The name Gobekli Tepe literally translates into navel hill. So Gobekli Tepe was indeed a navel. And you have the bird on the left holding the omphalos, the navel stone, marking the navel, birthing civilization. And then you have the other birds facing to the right. And I would argue that this means they're facing east. This was an omphalos marked on the eastward journey that was heading in the eastward direction, out from the 0 point. And I would argue that Gobekli Tepe was not the 0 point, but was one stop along the way, one omphalos, one navel of the earth marked along the way. Now, Easter Island, notice the two birds are facing the omphalos. And I would argue that Easter Island was a site where the eastward and westward journeys of the birdmen civilizers, this Easter Island is a spot where they met. So, and in fact, we do see evidence for that in Easter Island. Easter Island, the Rongo Rongo script, nearly matches 26 identical characters of the Indus Valley script. So civilizers came from the west carrying ancient wisdom from the Indus Valley. But Easter Island also has classic South American style architecture. So it seems like civilizers came from the east, from South America, from Cuzco and Peru as well. So, through the lens of naval theory, Easter Island, the two birds facing the omphalos, this was a spot where the eastward and westward journeys aligned and met. And Gobekli Tepe, this is the marking of an omphalos on an eastward leg of the journey. Another question we have to ask ourselves in decoding these two pillars is, are we looking at birds or birdmen? And in the case of Gobekli Tepe, I would argue that the bird-like creature holding the disc, holding the omphalos, is not in fact a vulture holding a solar disc, but is in fact a birdman civilizer deity holding an omphalos. And how do we know this? Well, first of all, his beak is depicted almost the same as the Akpallu of Mesopotamia, but then his robe has a V-neck, similar to Urfaman's V-neck. You can almost see the buttocks of the birdman, the knees of the birdman, and then accentuated feet of the birdman. It looks like a man, a human, wearing a robe with a bird costume or a bird garb, marking the omphalos. And on the pillar, on the back of the statue of Easter Island, the two birds that are marking the omphalos there, well, they have human-like hands and feet. So I would argue that these two are depicting humans dressed in bird garb marking an omphalos. And this fits with the Navel Genesis Theory, that birdmen, humans in bird garb, took on the role of civilizer deities on a global quest around the planet, traveling in opposite directions to birth civilizations. Take Thoth, for example, the Egyptian civilizer deity, always depicted as a human with the head of a bird. And Thoth taught the Egyptians mathematics and astronomy and agriculture. And pretty much, wherever you see the birdman show up in ancient history, civilization really gets going. Now, what about the myth of Noah and the flood? And after the flood has destroyed all of mankind, Noah releases two birds. But scholars have always pointed out that it's unusual that Noah released a second bird because the first bird just flew back and forth until it found land. So why did Noah release two birds? Well, maybe he released two birds because the first process of starting civilization again after the flood was sending one bird to the east and one bird to the west, and they were both going to start civilization all along the way on this global journey around the world. Why do we find the same exact myth in India? But in India, instead of Noah, it's Manu, and he's saving the 7 sages from the flood. Well, the 7 sages is the exact same name that the Mesopotamians gave the bird-like civilizer deities who started civilization over again after the flood, otherwise known as the Apkallu. So in India and Mesopotamia, you have the 7 sages, both starting civilization over again after the Great Flood. And I suspect that this story of the Great Flood was actually brought around the world by these civilizers, and it was always locally adapted as well. So in some versions of the story, you have the ark landing on Mount Ararat in Turkey. In Greek myth and the myth of Deucalion, the ark lands on Mount Parnassus. In Inca mythology, the Great Flood, as told by Viracocha, emerges out of Lake Titicaca to destroy the world. It's always adapted locally. It's the same story, but the geographical references are localized to engage the people of the region. The Mesopotamians, of course, tell the same flood myth in the Epic of Gilgamesh, although multiple variations of the story exist, and it's always the same. As the flood is ending, birds are sent out as the first process of restarting civilization after the flood. The same myth, of course, makes its way to the Andes, and that is the Una Pachacuti, the flood that Viracocha caused to destroy the people around Lake Titicaca, but he saved 2 people to bring civilization to the rest of the world. There's always 2 people because they're traveling in an eastward direction and a westward direction as they're restarting civilization after the flood. And what did the native people of the Andes say was the eventual fate of Viracocha? Well, he arrived at Cusco, the navel of the earth, and then set out across the Pacific, where he walked away across the water until they disappeared. The word Viracocha literally means sea foam, and it's almost as if the Viracocha were on a journey around the world, and once they had done what they were there to do in the Andes, they had to continue on. Like a bird traveling around the world, laying eggs, planting seeds, starting civilization. And that, in a nutshell, is my Navel Genesis Theory, that there was an ancient order, a cult of civilizers that would take on the role of birdmen and start civilizations traveling around the world in opposite directions, heading east, heading west. I think the Akpallu were part of this order. I think the 7 sages starting civilization in India were part of this order. I think that Thoth was part of this order. I think that Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha were part of this order. I think that Hotu Motua, the legendary founder of Easter Island, the original birdman of Easter Island, was part of this order. And I think whatever birdman is depicted on Pillar 43 at Gobekli Tepe was part of this order. And it seems like there was a deliberate effort to reboot civilization, perhaps after some great catastrophe or civilization-destroying event, maybe an impact event, a great flood. I think the Great Flood did probably happen, but I think that pretty much every great civilization we know, ancient Greece, Egypt, the Andes, Easter Island, you name it, I think they were all a product of this deliberate birthing process, and that all the founders of these places, the original civilizers, were all part of the same cult and order. And the places where they really got to work were the foundational places, the place where they birthed these civilizations. They would name it the navel of the earth. They would select a place that looked like a navel. They would mark it with a navel stone, and they would get people making lots of figurines with people with their hands around their navels, I think, to be very clear to future generations, perhaps. And there's a lot of questions we don't know. What was the 0 point? Where was their civilization that got destroyed before they started setting out on this mission to save their civilization and start it over again and plant the seeds? What period of time was this occurring over? It seems like it was occurring over thousands of years, unless all these civilizations were starting around the same time, but it took varying amounts of time for them to get going. These are just some of the questions that we've got, and of course, I think this theory explains a lot. I'm going to continue researching it because it's fascinating. A lot of the questions I've had with ancient civilizations usually stem from the connections between them. Why do civilizations all around the globe build pyramids? Why do they align them to the stars? Why do they align their structures to the solstices and the equinoxes? Why are there so many nearly identical myths among civilizations? How do they all just somehow know how to cut and carve and transport stones weighing 80 tons and fit them together precisely? There's just so many similarities, and it's hard when you really start looking into it not to kind of become obsessed with those similarities and the visceral internal sense that there's a real mystery here and there's something more going on that we're just not seeing. And I think this is it.